Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Real Life Theology Podcast. Today, we've got another great recording. This was actually one of our most top attended breakout sessions from our 2025 Renew Gathering. It is called Theological Thunderdome. It's hosted by David Young and a panel of individuals talking about certain cultural and theological topics. I hope you guys enjoy this episode.
Theological Thunderdome, which was not my choice of a title. Bobby Harrington came up with that, thinking it would draw a crowd, and it turns out he was right. So what we want to do in here is have a conversation. I have several distinguished guests here, and I'm the moderator. I'm David Young. I work for Renew, so I'm one of the leaders of the Renew University program, which I'm happy to promote to you, our certificate in theology program. But I have several guests that I'm going to introduce to you in just a moment. And we were charged by Bobby Harrington, by the director of Renew, to come up with a theological discussion that we thought might be interesting and one that might have a little tension to it. And so I met with several of these guys, and we came up with this idea. The early church of the first several centuries, certainly by the second and third century, had a set of very radical ethics. And the question we want to ask is, are those ethics reproducible in our era? And if so, why? And if not, why not? And so I am happy to introduce to you, and sorry, I didn't print off the bios, which is an oversight on my part. So as clumsy as it looks, I'm going to read the bios off my phone. And I am happy to introduce to you in no particular order, the order that I screenshotted it on my phone. Down here to my furthest right, this is Nathan Guy. Would you stand up, Nathan, let them see you? Nathan is an associate professor of ethics and a director of the David E. Smith Healthcare Ethics and Human Dignity Initiative at Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas. In addition to, he serves as an adjunct professor in the School of Professional Studies at St. Louis University and the preaching minister for the Westside Church of Christ in Searcy. I've heard you preach, and you're a good preacher. He received his training from Freed-Hardeman University, Harding School of Theology, the London School of Economics, where he received a master's degree, Master of Philosophy from Oxford University, and a PhD from Cambridge University. He's published several books, which you're welcome to bring up. And let's just say welcome to Dr. Nathan Guy. And again, in the next order is my friend Elvis Isaacs. Say hi. Yes. Elvis is a Master of Divinity student at Yale Divinity School, where he's pursuing a calling to serve the church through faithful teaching and pastoral ministry. With a deep love for God's Word and the history of the church, his studies focus on how Christians engage with Scripture, theology, and culture, especially in figures like Irenaeus and the Syriac church fathers. So yes, unless Nathan, you know Syriac. He's the only guy in the room who probably knows Syriac, ancient Syriac. And before seminary, Elvis worked as an environmental scientist in Canada and helping restore land and lead safety initiatives. He has a heart for mentoring young adults, defending the truth of the gospel. I'd like to hear that. And equipping the next generation to think deeply and to live faithfully. Thanks for coming, Elvis. He's from Calgary, Canada, and I assured him he is welcome in the United States of America because, anyway. And then our third guest is Chad Harrington, who is Bobby's son, owner of Harrington. Hey, y'all didn't clap enough. Give him a good round. Owner of Harrington Interactive Media, a book publishing company in Franklin, Tennessee. He runs a leadership and ordination training at Harpeth Christian Church to raise up the next generation of ministry leaders. He has Bible degrees from Ozark Christian and Asbury Theological, and is currently studying historical theology at the University of Aberdeen, working on a PhD there. Is a co-author of I'm not mentioning books, but you're welcome to bring up your books. So welcome, Chad. We're glad to have all three of you. I'm going to call you by your first name, so I know you're probably used to being called other things. But Nathan, are you able to introduce the subject if I call
Sure.
on you in a second? Okay, so as we were working on what to talk about, we came across a reference by Tim Keller to a couple of books by a New Testament scholar named Larry Hurtado, who's passed away. But Larry Hurtado was making the argument that the early church grew fantastically because it had such a radical set of ethics that I personally am not sure that the American church practices. I don't even know if the American church wants to practice, the North American, I should say. And so that's going to be our discussion and the tension of our conversation. And I'm going to ask Nathan, if he will, who's somewhat of an expert in this area, introduce us to these ethics and why this matters.
Okay, so you've heard the phrase orthodoxy, which is believing right things. Orthopraxy is having right habits, right practices. And Hurtado says that, if you were an ancient pagan and you adopted some new cult, you could do that with very little offense to whatever you already had. Syncretism was all the rage. You could join lots of groups and not really offend any other deities. Christianity was fairly unique in this idea of one God and no others, and a new set of way of living that changes everything about you. So behavior change as an ethic, a group ethic is fairly unusual in the Roman world. And according to Keller's summary of Hurtado, I read Hurtado and I didn't see these five exactly this way, but Keller's summary of Hurtado is that the early church was well known for these five things. Number one, because God is a God of inclusion, they were multi-ethnic, multiracial, intentional. Number two, because God cares about those on the margins, they were invested in the poor, both within their community and outside their community. And people took note of this. They were glad to have Christians in their neighborhood because people got taken care of. Number three, because they believed in a God who fights our battles for us, they were committed to nonviolence. They did not fight back. Number four, flowing out of those, they were committed to a radical sexual ethic, one of fidelity, purity, monogamy. And number five, they were universally opposed to abortion and infanticide. Now, and if you think about it, there's actually a gospel logic that connects those five. You can think of it our version of TULIP, okay? They really do connect. If you think about one kind of leads to the others. So we want to talk about why was that? What's the powerful arguments for those? What does that look like today? And would it be different? Is there reasons why they chose those? They certainly were intentional. It wasn't just by accident. But in what ways? So that's where we want to start.
It's great summary. So I just want to start by calling on individuals for just a moment. I think I'll start with you, Chad. So we're saying multi-ethnic, deliberately multi-ethnic, radical sexual ethic, which in some of the church fathers was almost an aversion to sex. But it turned out, to some extent, to the advantage of the empire. Radically pro-life, totally nonviolent, and a very radical concern for the poor, a very selfless concern for the poor. Here's my question. It's a judgment question, so we'll pass on. We may not agree with you. It's okay if we don't. Your assessment, do you see that the North American churches, would you say we're similar to that? How much would you say the North American churches look like those ethical positions of the church, at least in the first several centuries? So I'm asking you to evaluate. That's the conversation. So we have to have an opinion on something here.
So your question is how, let's assume Keller's argument or summary of Hurtado, and how true of a radical ethic is that of the American church?
That's right.
Okay. So I kind of just gave my gut level reaction to each one of them, and I rated us out of 10. So here's your specific answer. And I don't know everyone or everything. I have like we all have this very narrow view of the church, right? For radically multiracial and multi-ethnic, I try to say, like, I've been to a lot of churches in different parts of the country, from Idaho to Kentucky, Texas, Florida, and I see we're about a 2 out of 10 maybe for radically multi-ethnic, in my experience. Radical care for the poor. I wanted to be a little more generous with this one. I don't see radical engagement at a personal, incarnational level with the poor. But let's say we counted monetary contributions. I said 4 out of 10. Again, just my perspective. I also live in Williamson County, Tennessee, which is one of the wealthiest counties in the country. So I'm like, man, we need to do more. For radical nonviolence, 2 out of 10. Radical sexual ethic, with purity culture as being, I think, often a good thing, I said 3 out of 10. And then probably the highest would radically opposed to abortion and infanticide. I actually don't know how many abortions happen in the church. I don't know the stats. So I said 6 out of 10. So we get 34% from my assessment.
That is so precise. Thank you for your precision. You're like your dad, man. That's good. So
that's not a great scorecard, though. Just to, I guess, speak into that, I'm pretty discouraged when I think about it. And I think what stands out to me, especially with some of these, it's kind of like, can we just talk about it? So that's why it's cool. This is awesome. I'm grateful that we can just have this conversation to say, hey, is there maybe one area that we can move forward in our little domain of just even talking about it and recognizing, the issue or the challenges that come with that. So, yeah.
That's good. Well, let's do that. Let's talk about it. Elvis, I want to turn to you for a moment. So you came from Calgary, Canada, is where you've been most recently before you moved to Connecticut. How would you assess the Canadian church, the state of the Canadian church?
It's quite a complicated question. I think, just like Chad, I think I can only speak about kind of what I've seen and experienced. So I'm from Calgary, Alberta. It's a city, it's a metropolitan city, and just like a lot of cities, there's more immigration that comes, and there's people from various skills, and so churches tend to be more diverse than different parts of Alberta. But even in some of the diverse churches, there's still challenges with integrating people from different ethnicities that I've noticed, and people have even said we go and we sit in this part of the church and in these pews, and our family comes and sits here, and then when the service is over, you're talking to your family, you're talking to your friends, and then you got to go because the kids need to do something, and they have to eat and this and that. And in a weird sense, it kind of creates a kind of division between a segregation almost within the church, even if it's not intentional. People are sitting with their own family, and it ends up kind of looking like, at least for my church, there was almost like a spectrum. It was like, white, brown, black, right? It was kind of like, and it wasn't intentional. No, people weren't choosing to sit with people from their own ethnicities. And it took actually being intentional, trying to find ways where you can celebrate different cultures. Like we'd have events where we'd celebrate African culture and have different meals and foods, and people would be making that and serving that to various events, and that was a helpful spot for people to come in and feel like they were part of this integrated community, and not just kind of living in these parallel churches where people are sort of speaking to the same demographic every single week, and then kind of going back to their own homes. In ways to improve, I think especially when we talk about like being pro-life and wanting to stand up for the unborn, is helping, like, increasing the access to adopting children, and that's often a struggle for a lot of like developing countries, especially developed countries. There's so many barriers that are put in place for families who want to have a child that can't because they don't have the finances, which is ridiculous. Because like, if you were to be fair and say like, the people who do plan to have children, do they have all of their finances in line, you know, to the same degree as people who are planning to adopt? And it's not the same, you know. But we have this unfair expectation to have all these people to have everything figured out, have all these things checked, in order to be able to do that. And part of that is also increasing like culture in the church where you can talk about adopting. I remember this conversation got brought up, and people were like, honestly, I've thought about it. You know, so one person at a church was saying, I've thought about this, but I didn't even know what people would think about that. You know, like I didn't know even how to even get started. And that's something that's where I feel challenged. I'm like, okay, like I've always considered, you know, adopting a child, and, you know, God willing, if that happens, I try to take up the opportunity to, you know, ask people who've done it. And I think there's various ways where we can help train people to be in a place where they, like, churches are seen as places where you can get support for women who are pregnant and have needs. An idea that came to my mind was, let's, you know, have young adults or, you know, children or whoever, you know, who wants to provide like childcare services, do that, right? Like, don't just like say like, oh yeah, we'll do this if you need it. Like, do it for people who don't need it, right? Like, do it, get in a place where you're already training people to take care of kids. Say like, oh, you know, you guys, you know, go on a date, and we'll take care of your kids for the evening, right? So eventually you get to a spot where you've kind of developed certain skills, and you're able to have people in your church that can, you know, meet those needs when it comes by.
So let me ask this question. This is jump into the heart of one of the things we talked about, and I'll let you take the first stab, Nathan, since you have the most degrees. Okay, so living in a democracy where, you know, where we the people are responsible for our own government, where is the line between the kingdom of God, the church, if you will, and the government? So, for example, if the early church was radically nonviolent, should I serve in the military as a Christian today? Is there a problem with that? Would they have done that in the first few centuries? Should I ask for justice, which, you know, seems in Scripture at least to be the priority, the number one job of government is justice, whereas in the kingdom, our ethics are mercy, and we're to refuse justice. Like, help us sort that out, because that's the real tension for a lot of us. So I'll turn it over there, and you take it which direction you want to go, and then the rest of you can reply if you'd like.
So I get the easy one. That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, from a historian perspective, leave the theologian aside for a second. From a historian perspective, were there soldiers, Christian soldiers in the Roman army? Yes, there were. It's not always clear if they were converted as soldiers and stayed in their positions, 1 Corinthians 7 thing, stay in the calling where you're called, or if they became that after. It's not always clear. From a history perspective, I can't think of a single Christian writer in the first 3 centuries who advocates for that. I can't think of one. I do know people who say there is no one, but I'm just saying I haven't read them all.
Right.
So I'm just saying I can't think of one who thinks that's a good idea. So think about that. Now, what's going on in that culture that's different than now? This is before Constantine, okay? To fight for the Romans was a different thing. Let's be fair here. It was a different thing. But there was a sense, there was a gospel logic to the idea of, when I was baptized, I died. And when I see other people, I see them as potential converts. And my goal is to win these people to the faith. I can't do that if I kill them. So that's sort of the thinking there behind it. So brotherhood of humanity thing. If we're going at the people, it was common to set your children out. There were painted circles in Rome where you could have human garage sales. People would set their children out. Christians would go and take them and raise them in their homes and in the community. There were sick people who were not in the church, who were going to be left to die. The church took them in. So the idea of we're brotherhood of humanity, and we're multiracial, multi-ethnic. So there was no opposing army that didn't include someone that I have an obligation to care for. So that way of thinking, I think, just permeated the Christian thinking. We're strangers, we don't have a homeland, we're brotherhood of humanity, and we go to the cross rather than send others. And so I think all that was just in the thinking of how you live. Says a historian. As a theologian, today, can a Christian be in the military? Can they fight? I have to say I'm agnostic. And the reason why I'm being agnostic is it's a complicated question, and I don't feel confident when I try to start doing this without being hypocritical. You know, would you lock your doors? Would you hit somebody if they're trying to do something do harm to your family? Do you believe in police officers? You know, I wouldn't want to make a statement other than to say this question. What would it look like for Christians to think of themselves as a witness to the culture of what the new heavens and new earth will look like in how we choose to treat our neighbors? Take that question, run it through the gospel lens, and whatever answer you come with, I trust you to handle that well. That's where I am on that.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
You said that the 5 things can be tied together. I was curious. I hadn't heard you talk about that.
Well,
tie them together.
Okay, so
is that relevant for this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I jump ahead a little bit? There's a woman named Louise Perry. She is not a Christian. She's not a believer in God, in fact. But she's British, and she worked, and she was a very, very strong atheist, feminist, all that. And she worked at a rape crisis pregnancy center. And she wrote a book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Powerful book, difficult book. And she says, this sexual revolution of the 60s was a terrible idea. It was bad for women. What you ended up with was Hugh Hefner's and Marilyn Monroe's. Men treated women as objects, and women felt no worth. And so this is terrible. What we need is a radical sexual ethic, something like monogamous relationships where you stay together and you love each other for a lifetime. Well, she started getting on all these Christian podcasts to talk about this, right? In 2023, she wrote an article in First Things, which is a ecumenically Catholic journal. The title is, We Are Repaganizing. Now, this is going to blow you away. She's already said we need a radical sexual ethic. Now, that's within the, I mean, if you bring her to talk about sexual ethics, I'll guarantee she'll be for a lot of things you're not for. But what she's saying is we need faithfulness. This is what she says in this article. She goes, I've been thinking about that. This Christian ethic that applies to that is really powerful in a lot of other ways. You know, Christianity also freed women because women were seen as not objects, you know. And if that's true, then the most vulnerable are not women, they're children. And not just that, infants, not just that, the ones who are in the womb. So really abortion should not be something we're for. And besides that, if we see the brotherhood of humanity, we really should be against violence towards other people. And she started naming all of these 5 things. She said that I'm just so blown away by the early Christian witness that seemed to think if you elevate the brotherhood of humanity, all under that God is God and we're brothers of each other, then it changes the way we think about abortion and violence and euthanasia and racial barriers. And I just thought, she sees it. She sees what I would call the gospel logic of it all. Yeah. One more thing. Just war theory, is a Christian theory.
That's
So,
right.
so I just want to make sure you understand that it's nonviolence for the first 300 years. Constantine becomes emperor, and suddenly everybody's okay with it, and there's no real argument. And so I just don't know what to do with that.
Well, okay, I said it was open, but I want to push on this a little bit more. So forgetting for just a moment, or setting aside, not forgetting, the question of violence, police officers and things like this. What obligation do we have to our democratic state? Because if it's true that the kingdom of man, as Augustine called it, and the kingdom of God are really that separate, how do we live out these ethics? I see a problem living out these radical ethics and also being responsible for my politic. I feel like they're in tension with one another. I would say, okay, there's a big part of me that says I don't want to abandon my political responsibility as a member of a democracy. At the same time, I could make this case, but I'm not making the case. So you don't have to argue with this specific illustration. You can argue with the principle. But I would say, okay, immigration needs to be governed by law. That is, that's a rational democratic position. For a democracy, I don't mean political party. We should have strong military. All of those things make perfect sense to me as a member of this democracy. But they're in tension with this early church witness. So, Elvis, help me with that.
Yes. And I think that tension, having that tension there, is actually a good thing, because there are two parts of this paradox of, like, one, the institutions that God has put in this world are divinely instituted. So, God has given the authority for the government to wield a sword, as Romans 13 says, and that is to maintain order, that's in order to maintain justice and civil liberties, right? But then there's this other side of the paradox, is that we're not of this world, right? We're not called to be citizens of this particular nation or that or this or that, that we have this transcendent purpose and meaning that that God's calling us, this multi-ethnic, racial, like, church that goes across the world. So navigating that is important to do, and figuring out how we integrate those two things can be challenging, because the legal system, politics itself is not a value-neutral position, right? We vote for the things we believe in, and it's not like one person is, like, trying to force their views down someone else's throat, and the other side isn't. If you are against, let's say, slavery, you have to restrict the right for people to choose to own a slave, right? And there is rights that end up getting taken away in order for someone's vision of the future to be instantiated. So in order to do that, there's always this negotiation between freedom and, having laws that are virtuous, that are, in accordance with Scripture. But I think but it's my opinion that I don't think every single Christian view should necessarily be reflected in the legal system. And I think that's because there is just sufficient diversity, even amongst conservative Christians, that I think it would be incoherent for that to even be possible. And I'll give you an example. Like, for example, in the Roman Catholic Church, remarriage for any reason while your spouse is still alive, regardless of the divorce, is considered adultery, right? Unless you get an annulment. And there's no guarantee that you'll get an annulment. And all that means is, like, you were never married to begin with. So that's this whole thing. So even amongst conservative evangelicals, there's disagreement. Like, what do we, people will say if there was adultery, if there was, abuse, there was all these things, then it's a valid divorce and you can get remarried. But Catholics would say, no, that's not a valid remarriage. So let's say you create a government where you're enforcing certain regulations, you make, adultery illegal. well, are you going to start taking people from your congregation who is remarried, who you think is, remarried justly, and who, got a valid divorce? So I think that's complicated, and no matter how you, divide it up, you're never going to get to a place where you could agree with 99% of the people you live with, and you'll still find a reason to burn someone at the stake. And if you study church history, there are plenty of examples of people who agreed on a whole ton, leavened bread versus unleavened bread, having beards versus no beards, celebrating Easter on this day versus not. And there's so many. Like, you could agree with like 99% of things and still find ways to disagree. So that's a caution where I'd say it's important for your values to reflect to be reflected in the country that you live in. And Christians like William Wilberforce and even in India, Indian Christian missionaries fought against the practice of sati, which is when the husband dies, the wife is supposed to jump into the burning pyre. So while the husband's being cremated, the wife would have to jump in and die. And Christians fought against that and abolished that practice. And there's many ways Christians have stood against that, but there's this negotiation of how much of biblical rules should be reflected in the legal system. And
I want to push on it one more time. I live in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, just south of Nashville, which is the center of Tennessee. It's literally the center of Tennessee. In 1863, there were two restoration movements, that's Christian church, Churches of Christ, Disciples of Christ. Two influential restoration people living or visiting Murfreesboro. One of them was David Lipscomb, who is founder of Lipscomb University, the publisher of the Gospel Advocate, and in my opinion, the real father of the a cappella Churches of Christ in the American South. Yeah. Lipscomb believed that we should just let the humans govern their thing. Forget them, to heck with them, what do we care about them? So Lipscomb said, we have our own kingdom, stay out of that. He especially was offended that Southern Christians and Northern Christians were killing each other. And he eventually developed the position, which he published later in a book, that you should just stay out of all form of government. A Christian shouldn't even vote, shouldn't work for the post office, let the pagans have their government. We have our government, and it's the Christian church. At the very same time in Murfreesboro, there was an adjutant general to William Rosecrans in occupying the city of Murfreesboro. The armies of northern aggression had moved into Tennessee. And that general was a guy by the name of James Garfield. James Garfield was also a minister in the Restoration Movement, and he was a general for the invading armies. When the war ended, Garfield eventually became president, but first he was a radical Republican who believed that the northern states should severely punish the southern states for their rebellion. He did this as a Christian because he believed the southern states had been so egregious in their sin of slavery that they deserved to be punished. Both of those in Murfreesboro at the same time, both in the Restoration Movement. Chad, which one was right?
Really? See, you can do that because you know that I love you.
It's a Thunderdome, man.
Well, we have to remember that James Garfield was the one who said, when he became president, after having just been an elder in the Church of Christ, that I just stepped down from the most important job that there is, which is to be an elder of the church. So there definitely was a tension for him. And David Lipscomb was pretty radical in a lot of ways. He was radical in generosity. He was radical. He gave his 110 acres that is now Lipscomb University. He rode 10 miles on horseback to Nashville every day to publish the Gospel Advocate. When the cholera outbreaks that happened in the the 19th century happened, a lot of people left. He's actually a great example to bring some of these together. A lot of Christians left the city of Nashville, but he stayed. And not only did he stay with the poor and the sick, but he took care of them. And not only did he take care of them, he took care of the black constituent in Nashville. Now, David Lipscomb had asthma. And you would think that a wise man would say, well, I have asthma, I'll let the young people take care of the poor and risk getting cholera. But he stayed, and you might think there was a miracle and he didn't get cholera, but he actually got it and had asthma and survived. He was a radical man in his own right. At least he was consistent. But we also have to remember that in the Gospel Advocate, David Lipscomb would publish various views. He was fine if you believed something, as long as you could back it up peaceably. So I'm glad you brought David. I don't know as much about Garfield, but I'm glad you brought David Lipscomb into this, because he was a radically consistent man, and he was radical for the gospel in his own way.
Would you say, before you move, would you say he more accurately reflected those initial ethics that Nathan brought up?
Yeah, I mean, we have to. Yes, I do. I personally think that he was more in line with the early church. I don't know how much he studied the early church, but we've got this challenge within the Restoration movement today, where we're an early church kind of movement. Those of us who are a part of those churches. If you're not, that's okay too. But that's my context. So the first 3 centuries are part of the early church, based on the New Testament, and we've got these precedents that we've talked about. But we've also got the challenge that if you can look at people like Stone and Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell, some of these early 19th century and then into the 20th century, they were all pacifists. Now, what's interesting is Alexander Campbell's son fought in the Civil War, even though his father was opposed to it. So there's an interesting kind of second generation challenge there. And so we've got to answer all these for each generation, right? So, but I would say, as we look at some of these early examples and some of these tensions, to me, the question for us is to ask not so much what's right, but what does God teach us and call us to do? In other words, we can't be like, well, David Lipscomb did this, so I'll do that, or, Origen believed that, so we've got to use this as fodder for making our own decisions based on what we believe is true scripturally. So to answer your question directly, I think that David Lipscomb's sort of anti-institutionalism was more radical than I think we ought to be in all circumstances. He was against missionary societies and all that. But the tolerance he had for other views, I think, was admirable. So I lean towards some of his views on the poor, engagement with the poor, nonviolence, and ethnic diversity. Those are 3, I think, that he really championed really well. But yeah, I mean, I think that's all I have to say about that.
That's really good. That's good for on the spot.
Can I add to that?
Yes, you can.
There's what he believed, then there's what he wore on his sleeve. I mean, I know when asked, this is what he said, but I mean, he preached in the army camps as well.
Lipscomb preached in the army camps, yeah.
He did some chaplaincy work. So I think his willingness to talk about the gospel wherever people would let him do it, it's beautiful and remarkable. And that goes back to the agnostic comment. I mean, yes, we're early church, but we're early church. And early church, you think about the scriptures, for me to say I'm against something, I need to know that scripture forbids it and it doesn't. For me to be for it, I need to see that the ethic of Jesus clearly points to it, and I don't think it does. So I'm agnostic. I think people may have very good reasons, and I think it's between them and God.
Well, I'm going to come to you next, Nathan. Before I do, I just want to tell y'all that Garfield, when he was stationed in Murfreesboro, he went to the Main Street Church, Church of Christ, Acapella, East Main Street today. And one of the oldest ladies there told me in the 1980s that, of course, they used only 1 cup back then, that the Southern ladies, just before the communion cup got to Garfield, would often spit in the cup. So I don't know why I'm telling you that. Because they weren't really happy he was there. Is my point. So Nathan, what's so a typical evangelical church, and I include, Christian churches and a cappella churches of Christ and that, is very middle class. It's a middle class ethic. It's a middle class life. Are there steps even that sort of the middle class ethic can take towards a more radical early church ethic?
Yes.
What would you advise?
Yeah, advise is a tough word because I'll say something and I'll think, well, Nathan, why don't you do that? Elvis made a good point about, thinking about like adoption, but the early church was more radical than that. The whole community saw itself as the parents for these children. We'll raise them, right? Bring them on in. And that's for a church to think of itself as incredible solidarity, which we just don't. We're individuals that gather together.
Right.
They thought of themselves as a band of brothers, live together, die together, and that's huge. So I think when we think about giving, maybe in your communion, in your giving portion of church, I don't know how it is in all your churches. Do you have the same talk for the Lord's Supper and the giving, or do you do something different when it comes to giving? I'd encourage something different when it comes to giving, and to talk about how giving in 2 Corinthians is first giving of yourselves. And so in what way can we do that this week? How can we be more radically attuned to the needs of the people around us when we have been given freely all things? Anybody else in here spend way too much time in the week thinking about what I want? Forgetting about how incredibly gracious God has been to all of us, and the great needs of the people around us that we can go for a long time without noticing. That's something.
That's great.
Yeah.
Hey, before I go on, does anybody know what time this ends? 8 o'clock, so we got 22 minutes or something like that. I want to ask Elvis, I want to ask you a question, then we're going to throw it open. If you have questions, then, or challenges, I just welcome you to challenge these guys. So Elvis, on the question of, we've talked about radical care for the poor, and we've talked some about the question of violence and all. Are there steps we can take? So it appears to me that the cultural divide between some of the races in America is so deep that even partnerships often feel superficial. And what I have observed, but I could be wrong on that. What is a good next step for bridging some of the ethnic divides in the Christian churches in North America?
Prayer. Pray for unity. Pray that the leadership of the country would unite people. Focus on the humanity of each other, and that's something that I've been challenging myself with. When I meet people I disagree with, is to see who's this person behind these views that I disagree with. And at the end of the day, like, all of us humans, we all want the same thing. We all want to belong to a community. We all want to feel like we're contributing towards something bigger than ourselves. We all want to have some kind of an impact. And there's that longing that I think as Christians we can tap into. And Christianity offers a transcending story, a way to ground, your reality, to say, like, no, there is this world isn't just it. You don't have to feel as if, this is the only chance you get, and you gotta, do it all or not. And, in the end, doesn't matter if you win the world. Nothing ultimately matters. But the Christian message provides a hope and a way to unify that I hope we can take advantage of. Yeah, so that's what I'd say. As as I'm trying to work on, just trying to connect with people's humanity and see like what are some ways where I understand where this person's coming from, right? Like even on various, let's say the pro-life issue, right? Both sides believe they have everything to lose, right? Like what's the fear behind that? What's the insecurity? Where's this coming from? And let's talk about that, right? Because with some issues, you end up in a stalemate and you can't just compromise. But what's behind that, right? Let's try to unite and discuss and have those kinds of conversations. So that's kind of my 2 cents.
That's great. Okay, you have 3 really smart guys up here, and they're just hoping you'll ask them a good question. So I'm going to throw it open. Yes, sir.
I love this topic because I think it's very relevant for us today, because some folks that I've read said that basically those ethics saved Christianity, and that's why Constantine adopted Christians into the empire, because they took care of their neighbors, they took care of the poor. And there's a book written about how St. Patrick saved Christianity for the Western world because of his ethic of serving the poor and opening up the monasteries, that kind of thing. Are there some ethics today you believe that we've got to hold on to, especially as the Stone Campbell heritage, that will save Christianity, or we could lose Christianity if we don't hold to them?
Start with the first one. We're in a deeply polarizing world. Multiracial, multi-ethnic carries with it multi-perspective. It just does. And so I think we've got to be more intentional. Here's the harsh reality. And if you want to know how we're doing on that, pick whatever room you're in and look around. That's the best way to look around and say, how are we doing? And I know where I'm at, we got work to do. And the idea of, I know there's people being served over there, that's not the way Christians should think. If that was possible, if that was even allowed, Romans would have been a postcard, right? It would have been really easy. Why 16 chapters? Because if you can't be one in every way, then the cross means nothing. And I think if we can show that in all of our local churches, it's going to affect the way we think about everyone and everything. So that's where I would start.
That's good. I'm going to ask you to address your question to one speaker. Otherwise, we'll all feel the need to talk, and then you only get 2 questions. But once they answer the question, if someone else up here feels really strong, I got to say something, feel welcome to. So I'm going to take that as a question for you, Nathan. We have another question. Yes, sir.
Mr.
Elvis, yeah.
Pull on the thread a little bit when you're talking about like arts seeking to influence the laws of society. Mm-hmm. Bringing up like the interference of funeral pyre burning, the tradition of that, so should those Christians, that ended up changing the law. Mm-hmm. So should we not then seek to change unjust laws that we see? Mm-hmm. I guess that's what I'm wondering, because the original intent of that was I do understand where it's if we begin to say marriage, how do we draw the line on that? You have camps start fighting each other, but shouldn't then we seek to try and come to some understanding so we can seek to influence the law?
Did everybody hear that question? No. I'll repeat it, but
Sorry,
Tom, you had touched exactly the thing we're wrestling with. I'm glad to know somebody caught it.
Yeah.
So his question is, since Christians helped to end this despicable practice of burning widows, it was a Christian movement that stopped that publicly. Should Christians get involved and do things like that, or should we just leave that to the pagans and do our own thing? Is that a fair representation of your question?
Because I guess that was because when I picked up, it was originally you brought up the whole marriage and how do we address remarriage, and it's then should we not have opinions on anything, right? And I guess that's the hard question. Right.
Yeah. So the distinction I was trying to make was not enforcing every single moral issue that's within the church as a legal issue. Having a distinction between that, especially in areas where we, even as conservative Christians, cannot agree on certain things. It just makes no sense. How would that even look like? So, for the example that I gave about the widows being burned in the pyre. That was also, a corollary to like someone like William Wilberforce, supporting, being an abolitionist and fighting against slavery. So I do believe, we should, as Christians, influence politics, and because politics is not a value neutral thing, everything we vote for is something we believe in, and that's okay. We shouldn't be ashamed of like wanting our laws to be just and being reflected in Scripture. But I think there's a tension between, from where I started is like the institutions, the governments that are in power are divinely instituted, but we as part of the church, we're also part of a different kingdom, right? And there are areas where things will connect, and then areas where we can't really adjudicate on. And I want to include that sensitivity where we can say like these are areas where this is where the church has a stance, but we're not going to make that a legal law for everyone. And so that was my example with the remarriage.
I guess, can I follow up with that?
Sure.
How do we pick which moral issues to push and which ones not to push?
How do we pick which moral issues to push as Christians, and when do we say, we'll stay out of that fight?
Yeah, that is a great question. And
Can I ask a question deeper into that real quick?
Is it okay if he asks a deeper question? Sure.
With that, with that thought,
They're next to each other.
with
so-
that thought is maybe just flipping the question: is there a better way than trying to legalize morality? Because we look at 2023, Roe versus Wade was made illegal and headed to the states. States started to make decisions that didn't actually slow down abortions. It just made them happening in the.
It did in Tennessee. It slowed them down in the state of Tennessee
And
significantly.
people were jumping.
Yeah, they may have been
border.
going somewhere else.
So, and I'm not trying to defend it. I'm just saying, is there a way that the church can do it? I mean, we can exemplify. We live in a very separated culture where we're in our own homes, but people know what we're doing through Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and all of the things, Snapchat. But how do we show Christian values without it looking like humble bragging all the time? Like, hey, I'm serving in a food kitchen. So how do we as the church exemplify Christian values and live out that way where the world will catch the ripples without expecting it to become just legalized?
You want to take that one, or you want to hand it off to one of your teammates?
I can briefly respond to your question. So I don't have a one-size-fits-all type piece of wisdom to say like this is how we know which is worth fighting for, making legal, and which is not. That's the job for the church to discuss and come together and contemplate. But my point is to highlight that there is that tension that we have to recognize and provide some space for, what is this something that we want to take to a legal extreme? I think when it comes to like pro-life issues, it's a lot more clear. Like this is a life that's involved versus like the choice of like continual adultery or not. I think there's something you can actually stop adultery if you believe that's adultery. You can't really bring back a life. So I think if you want to look at from the perspective of consequence, what are some consequences that we're willing to tolerate in society? That could maybe give you an idea of like, okay, if this is too far, then we should make this a law that doesn't give everyone the right to do. Do you guys want to hop in?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Those are good questions. So, a framework that's been helpful for me to think about ethics is just to even think, and you have more of an expertise than me, so you can kangaroo off of this when I'm done. But to think about ethics not only in kind of three major buckets in terms of traditional ethics, but then also to think about the hierarchy of which are better ethics in general terms has been really helpful. So the lowest form of ethics, in my opinion and perspective, is what can be called results ethics, or it's sometimes called utilitarian. Does it work? If it works, it's good to do. Ethics meaning kind of a way of life, not just what's right and wrong. And so if you think about I'll go through them in kind of come back to your good question. Then there's the next would be, and this would be, I think, a higher level of ethics, something that's better than just what works, right? It's like drugs work. It doesn't mean you should do them. One up from that is deontological ethics, or what's called duty-based. So there's a law. And if the law says it, you should do it or not do it, depending on which law it is. But then the highest ethics, and this is true in Scripture, it's true in church history, is virtue ethics. Do it because it's right. Not just because you're told to, and not just because it works. And what's interesting in the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus does this wild matrix of all three dancing together at the same time. But raising to the pinnacle virtue ethics. Be like your Father in heaven. Not just because it works, because it often doesn't. You're going to walk 2 miles instead of 1. Not just because you're told to. I told you. You've heard it said, but I tell you. He's reorienting us to a kingdom ethic, a virtue ethic. And if you look at the American culture, I think a lot of these questions find their place by just sort of categorizing things. Where does the just war theory fit in that framework? Well, that's controversial, but it definitely fits in a utilitarian ethic, right? How do I save my family? It's by defending them. It works. Is it right? That's another question. So, there's an interesting book by Alan Kreider, and I'm going to tell you about this book, but I'm going to tell you I still haven't read it. But it's okay. It's okay. You can have a lot of books, and it's still good for you to not read them, but to have them. And I am a book publisher, so I really mean that. It's called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, 2016 by Baker. And it's about the improbable rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire. And this is a summary from Amazon. It says, the virtue of patience was of central importance in the life of and witness of the early church. The virtue of patience. They wrote about patience, not evangelism, and reflected on prayer, catechesis, and worship, yet the church grew. In other words, if you look at the American church today with all of our good emphasis on a good thing called the Great Commission, why don't we grow like the early church did, who did not really talk a lot about evangelism? Kind of like you said, I don't see it really prevalent in the first centuries. Yet they grew. And so this is why I want to read the book, is because of a virtue ethic is what caused the church to grow. So if you look at what let's call it the 2nd century, for example, why they made decisions to be martyred. And it was a decision to confess Christ, knowing what that would do. Why? Did it work? Well, it did not work for them to continue living in this life, so no. Was it commanded? You can make an argument that it was commanded. That was at least their interpretation of the scriptures. Was it right? And I think that would have been a unanimous yes. I want to quote from Irenaeus here because it's beautiful, but I want to just leave it. I don't want to talk too long. But I think that framework has been super helpful for me. Yeah.
I have a question over here. You brought up Tim Keller. In his interview with Kerry Newhoff, he brings up 4 of those. He left out the nonviolence. He said that's his biggest fear for the church in North America, is that because of politics you have churches, because one party grabbed hold of 2 of those, another party grabbed hold of 2 others, and probably nonviolence is ambivalent between them. He said that he is worried that the church can no longer stand up for those 5 things. Is there a way that we, especially as we are trying to bring back the first century church, what are some ways that all churches can uphold all 5 things and still be strength or powerful in their community?
I'm going to do this. That's a good question. And that's Keller's middle way, isn't it? We have only 7 minutes left. So each of you, Nathan, I'll let you go first. Each of you gets about 2 minutes. You can answer the question and give your your final remarks to us, admonitions, encouragements, invitation, altar call, if you will. There's a few seats up front if you want to come down. And then we'll go Nathan and then Elvis, and since you just talked, we'll end with you, Chad.
We tend to think at the state level, national level, but what really matters in most people's lives is their next door neighbor. It's at the local level. And every individual in your daily life can practice all five. And we know that. And that's the daily challenge to how we respond, right? This is the Sermon on the Mount over and over again. That's what I would say about that. To the question about is there a better way than top down, bottom up? There's a debate. Did the early church do what it did because it chose to do that, or because it couldn't do otherwise, right? And then I get the debate. But can I just tell you, the numbers are debatable, but Rodney Stark says that the church grew by an average of 3% a year. And you say, okay, let me tell you how this works when you think about exponentials. It grew from, some estimate 1,000 Christians in 40 to 6 million and 300. So depending on what geographical area you're looking at, some say it grew from 0.001% of the population to 56% of the population with no political power. So if we think, what's the best political arm to use to get the church going, I just want to say we've got a pretty good example of how to do it without even asking that question. And it has to do with how we treat our neighbor. That's what I'd say.
Elvis?
Yeah. So I want to talk about, care for the poor, and that's something that really stuck out to me. It's something that I've been trying to challenge myself, especially as I run into homeless people on the street, and wanting to reflect more on that and change my behavior. One thing that's always spoken to me so powerfully is John Chrysostom's as a incredible speaker and theologian. He's often seen as like the comparative equal to Augustine in the Eastern Church, and he's often referred to as the man with the golden mouth. Always defended, the poor, spoke against clerical abuse and people hoarding money for themselves. And one thing that he said that was so powerful was the poor are not only just made in God's image, but they also bear the image of Christ. And I thought it was so powerful, when Jesus said, what you've done to do for the least of these people, when I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was cold, you gave me clothes to wear. And when I didn't have a place to rest, you gave me shelter. And those things have been so powerful for me, when I see someone on the street, or even with my church, I've kind of just been, it's easy to want, something that's maybe more glamorous, you're, getting to preach or this or that. But one of the ways that, the early Christians saw like this close intimacy with God, where they got to directly give to Jesus what, as if that it was Jesus asking you for that, was to, help the poor. And to me, that was so powerful. And, it's been challenging, especially, thinking about the needs in our own community, thinking locally as well. What can we do to, help the people around us that are struggling?
Thank you. Chad?
Yeah. I think you touched about it. I think one thing that I'm even hearing from you, just your heart, and this is something that Jesus displays for us, is just humility. I think of all the traits, we often put love at the top. Sometimes I wonder if humility is at the top. Like a radical humility can lead to all of these. So John Dixon writes in a book called Humilitas, he says that when you study Greco-Roman literature, humility before Philippians 2 was written was always, at best, someone equal, submitting or bowing down to, or, to someone who was equal with them or above them. But Christ, who had been exalted on high, served those who were below him. And it changed Western culture.
Yeah.
Because now, that's what humility is now in Western culture, is what Jesus did. And the crux of it, no pun intended, was Philippians chapter 2, historically speaking. And I just wonder if that is the key. You know, he says, come to me all who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, because I am gentle and humble. Now, we know he was loving, but what does it look like to walk with Christ? Looks pretty easy. Looks pretty gentle. Looks pretty humble. And I know in my own life, the most fruit has come from when I am humble and not proud, not when I, like you said, look for the humanity in the other, look for Christ in the other, even the potential of Christ in the other, and to feel the pulsing of the kingdom in our veins when we get the heartbeat of God through actual interaction with the poor and with those that disagree with you politically. And I want to be more humble, because that's where Jesus is. That's probably all I got.
Thank you, Nathan Guy, Chad Harrington, Elvis Isaacs. It's been good. It's been a real privilege.
Thank you guys for listening to this episode of the Real Life Theology Podcast. If you liked this episode, please comment, like, and subscribe. If you want to get some of these breakouts in person, please come attend the 2026 Renew Gathering. It's happening April 21st and 22nd in Jefferson, Indiana. I hope to see you guys there.